Welcome back to Out of the Fold. This episode is the final part of my interview with Melissa. If you haven't listened to part 1, please do so before listening to this one. Melissa and I talked briefly in this episode about the child abuse scandals in Mormonism, and I compared them to the ones happening with Catholicism and the Jehovah's Witnesses. At the time we recorded this interview, the big recent reveal of the same happening in the Southern Baptist Convention had not occurred, so I didn't include it. My previous guest, Neil, has expressed interest in coming back on the show to talk about these allegations, as he did mention them in our conversation due to his own experience being raised Baptist. So, stay tuned for that. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comments about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. I mean, it sounds exhausting. It sounds exhausting to be that type of person that they found so attractive, to just maintain that all the time. I think that, like, if I met a girl that was like that, and I'm married now, but if I were single and in the time that I was single, if I met a girl that was like that, I would be more put off than anything else, honestly.
Yeah. But, being that happy, like, being happy was supposed to be the fruit of being spiritual, because
right.
if you love the gospel and you had the Spirit with you, then you would have light in your eyes and you would always be happy. And if you didn't, then you wouldn't. And we were always told that if you stop believing, you'll lose the light in your eyes. You won't have Jesus in your countenance anymore, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that you showed that you were a good potential wife, and all dates were job interviews for the position of wife and husband.
Right.
So it wasn't even romantic or fun. It was just, so how righteous are you?
Yeah.
You have to fit the church criteria list. And they would, they would preach this list to you from the time you're 12, but they would hardly ever mention, oh yeah, and you should actually be attracted to and should have good feelings generally for, maybe even love your spouse.
Yeah.
I think that was mentioned about twice. So, yeah, I know. It was weird. And then also I took a church history class there, and they were teaching us about the Council of 50, which was when Joseph Smith had himself crowned king of the world and was running for president at the same time. He created this underground committee of all of the top church leaders and civil leaders in Nauvoo to be the ones to run his government if he could take over. He was trying to win the presidency, but if he couldn't, he had this backup plan of trying to preach the gospel to what he called the Lamanites, the Indians,
mm-hmm.
so that he could use them as an army to take over the government. And so, yeah, we were learning about that in class, and it was presented as a good thing. Like, this was supposed to be great.
Whoa.
That he, rather than this was treason, he's a terrible guy. Like, it was mentioned that it was treason, but it was the right treason. It was godly treason.
Right.
So, and this was during the Romney-Obama campaign. And there were a bunch of white boys, and I never saw a girl wear these, and I never saw a non-white guy wear these, but there were all these white boys on campus wearing Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon for President t-shirts. And even then, that seemed kind of odd to me. But yeah, we were all sitting in class laughing like, oh yeah, they're the Danites. They're the secret religious police. That was so funny. Ha ha ha.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So then I look back at that and think, why was I okay with this on any level? This is not okay at all. But I think it was because I had been trained that my whole life that, well, the government has, even though it was ostensibly set up by God so that the gospel could come forth, the gospel is supposed to basically take care of the corruption that's in the government. And so, of course, this is a great thing to have, fulfill the white horse prophecy that Joseph couldn't or something like that.
Right.
And yeah, I think that was the worldview I grew up with. And then when I started to get a little bit older, once I graduated, and especially I felt like there was a switch in my brain that started to turn when I got about 25. I started looking back in that and going, that is insane. What were they teaching us there?
So, I mean, were you ever really devout, would you say? I mean, you said that when you were younger, you were part of the two Melissas and the Michael that were sort of like the troublemakers. So, I mean, were you ever really in it, like fully invested?
Yeah, I think, and I knew that I had to be, because if I had a brother that decided he didn't believe anymore as a teenager and was really trying to set boundaries and also rebel, kind of a mixture of both with my parents, and it felt like, the love, the acceptance, the support for him just went out the window, especially with my dad. And so I needed support. I wasn't healthy like him. I needed to have the family around me. So I had to be totally in.
Yeah.
I felt like there was no other option. I was terrified of them. And, but yeah, I think I always in my mind had things that I disagreed with, but I was always taught this line of, if there's anything that you don't like, it's just a few bad apples in the barrel. It's just a few bad people rather than a bad institution or a bad set of beliefs. Every time you had a disagreement with anything, it was always just, the church is perfect, but people aren't. And I bought that line for a while, but when I got into my 20s, over time, especially as I got in the mid and late 20s, I just started saying no. Like I've tried really hard to accept that, but I've just seen that this is church-wide, and this is like I've been trying to point out that there were problems since I was a teenager, and I've never been taken seriously, and I've just been told that I'm not forgiving enough, and that's just not how this is. So one of the things that really influenced me was, so John, by the way, the guy that thought that Friends was evil.
Yeah.
So he had taught us that we needed to take a journal with us to church every week and take notes. And I had done that. Like every week I had my church journal with me from the time I was 12. And I wish I still had all those journals. One day I just got so tired of looking at them and feeling depressed because they had so many bad memories attached that I threw most of them away. But I wish I could go back and look at what I was thinking now. Yeah, but it went from me just taking notes and writing things that I liked and found inspiring to realizing that there were some things that people would say in sermons and lessons, Sunday school lessons and things like that, that I thought were wrong. And sometimes I wouldn't know why. I would just feel like that's terrible. And so then I would try to write to figure out why I thought that way. And I think it was really great that I had that church journal, because the act of writing forced me to think about what I was hearing more. And so I basically went from just writing things I thought were cool to writing rebuttals to the sermons. There'd be like, okay, so-and-so said this, and I'm going to write down what they said, and now I'm going to write down why I think it's terrible. And so I started to think that a lot of things in the gospel, a lot of things that I was being taught were just immoral. They were wrong. They were shaming. They were, psychologically abusive. Long before I started figuring out that in a serious way that it wasn't true, although I was starting to doubt that too.
Hmm.
I started looking at God and thinking, you know, if Mormon God were my boyfriend, people would tell me that he's abusive and they would tell me to get away from him. I hope.
Right.
I hope they would tell me to get away from him. But, yeah, this guy is an abusive father figure, this Mormon God. And I started to doubt that he was real, but I also felt like I needed to set boundaries. And I'm glad that I did. But that's part of why I was depressed. I was at BYU starting to look at God and thinking, this guy's not a good guy. And I don't really even want him in my life. I kind of want him gone. But I can't just kick him out totally. So I started having prayers where instead of just saying, thank you and please bless me, which is the way you're supposed to pray, thank you for me having a prophet to follow, and please help me fulfill my calling. Instead of that, I started saying, okay, God, here's your rules. You are going to respect these rules, or you are not going to be here anymore.
Atta girl.
And thanks.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah. So, but the act of doing that, even though it felt empowering, it also felt very wicked. It's like, you don't set rules for God. That is the very definition of pride. But I felt like it was necessary. Like, I couldn't emotionally survive. Like, I was trying to convince myself not to jump in front of a car. I had to do something. And so, yeah, that's what I did. But then I just felt like because I was being wicked, I also wasn't worthy of help. And the way that we were taught to look at our schoolwork is you don't take credit for your own accomplishments. It's God helping you, and you did well on the test, partly because you studied, but partly because you had the Spirit with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that if I was basically kicking the Spirit out because it was manipulating me, that it couldn't help me on tests, and that I wasn't fitting in anymore with the orthodoxy around me and orthopraxy around me. And I hated praying. You know, I would avoid it for hours every night because I knew that I was obligated to pray, but
yeah,
I didn't really want to talk to this creepy, like, Mormon dad guy. So then because of that, I felt even more depressed, and it was hard to study. It was hard to just keep going with life, and my grades dropped. Like, I'd been doing pretty well in school. I was, in my major, they would post the scores, and of course they were anonymous, but I knew what score I got, and I was usually about fourth in the class out of, 50 to 100 people. I was doing fine. But after that, I just started getting less C's and just basically surviving.
Was that partially because so much of what you were being taught had that Mormon God, it was all integrated into the teaching? Or was it just what you just described where by losing faith, you kind of felt a little like you had less value?
Yeah, I think it was kind of both. It was just all wrapped up in, like, everything in your life at BYU was supposed to revolve around Mormonism. That was part of the reason for being there. And when I went there, I thought that would be fine. I thought that would be just cool. But yeah, but when that shift happened, I just kind of stopped feeling worthy.
Right.
And even though I wasn't really doing anything, I was basically just going to school and doing my homework. That was all that was really happening in my life. But
right.
Just because I wasn't, like, before, I had been constantly feeling like I was hyping myself up and burning myself into a nervous breakdown because I was trying to feel the spirit all the time and trying to look happy all the time. And then after that, I was like going, and we were also taught that our ancestors, like, you're always being watched, you know, angels are always watching you, taking notes of everything you do. They're watching you naked. Your ancestors are there trying to influence your life. And I'm just like, you know what, ancestors, you're the people that got my mom in a terrible childhood in the first place, because it was such a Mormon scandal when grandma got raped that she ended up in this terrible marriage and blah, blah, blah. Like, stay away from me, you crazy people. But yeah, you're not supposed to talk back. So yeah, I stopped feeling worthy after that.
Was that just like a family history that you just described, by the way? Was that something you were taught?
Yeah. So, my grandma had been gang raped and dumped on the side of the road after a high school dance.
Oh my God.
And this was in Bountiful, Utah. It was, small town Utah. It was a small town scandal, I guess, and it was considered her fault because she had been in a car of mixed company where there were a few people there, I think, or at least one guy who was older. He was like college age, who was one of the girls' dates, and it was just, you were in the car with a bunch of people at a dance, and they passed around alcohol, and I think she took one swig, but then they held it to her head and made her drink the rest of it. And then when she passed out, because that was like the first time she'd ever had alcohol, then they gang raped her. And then she stopped feeling worthy, ended up married to this really awful guy, and there were no charges filed for the gang rape, even though the police were the ones that found her. And, even though they knew what had happened to her and they knew who did it, it was just like, well, we don't care and it's her fault. That was my great-grandparents' attitude. And then that had huge repercussions in terms of the life that my mom had grown up with. And so she had been dealing with PTSD, and I felt like there could be some epigenetic thing that was passed down to me from all of the abuse that happened to not only my grandma, but my mom after that. And so I was like, and I was old enough that I was starting to understand a little bit about the impact of just the attitudes that I had been taught and the consequences they had had in my family. And I was kind of starting to be disgusted by it, or at least very troubled. And it was intense having a mom that was in a lot of therapy, and I needed to be in therapy and I wasn't. And we were both really struggling emotionally at that time. And so, yeah, it was just a lot of things combined. It was like gospel questions, and I had long since seen, even in young women, that like what your beliefs have consequences in terms of the way you act. And I was feeling like the beliefs and the actions that would come from the beliefs I was being taught were not good. Like, I was being told that the fruits of the gospel were good, but I was seeing that they were not. And that was a lot to take.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, that's absolutely horrible that happened, in your family to you said your grandmother, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think the only thing worse than the fact that happened is that your family then used that as a reason to be correctly Mormon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had expressed to my mother that I was really upset with how things had been handled there, and that I felt like that had set up our family for bad stuff that was even having an effect on me. Yeah. And she was just talking about how, no, your great-grandparents were wonderful people and you're not being forgiving enough. You're not having a good perspective. And, you know, I in the pre-existence, I chose to be born to an abusive man and this, you know, woman who wasn't doing well, because otherwise they would have both killed themselves, and I was there to be the light in their home. And I agreed to go down and be abused as a child to help my parents.
Right.
Yeah. So that was all pretty heavy. And all of that was kind of wrapped up all at once, and I had no one to talk to about it, because anytime I tried to bring it up with anybody, it was all, if you're having a problem with any of this, it's your fault.
Yeah. Yeah, that's this message that I keep hearing from people, that when those sorts of things happen, you know, it was your grandmother's fault because she wasn't surrounded by the right people. It had nothing to do with the people that actually committed the assault. It was her fault for not choosing the right peers. And then that's used as a way to teach you the same thing as you grow up.
Right. It was also that I felt like my grandma wasn't surrounded by the right family support. Like,
right.
The people that she was surrounded by, who were the wrong people to be surrounded by, were her family. And in a religion where your family, your ancestors are everything, and you honor them and love them and want to be with them in eternity. And I was sitting there thinking, well, if those people are the ones who are going to get elevated to the celestial kingdom, I'm not sure I want to be there. Right. I don't want to have to look at these people every day and smile and act like everything's fine, because it isn't.
Yeah.
And the atonement is not going to cover this and just make it all okay, because the atonement is really just what's being used to say that nobody has to take responsibility for what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And I was being, you know, if Jesus is totally okay with everything that's been done here and how things have been handled, I'm not really okay with this Jesus guy, you know?
Yeah.
So, but then that has huge consequences, because if you're thinking that, then of course, you know, I still loved my family, and I didn't want to be separated from my parents and my siblings forever in the afterlife. But I felt like there were I couldn't choose to be with them part way and also avoid the people that I wanted to avoid and have my own boundaries. Like, Mormon heaven is a boundaryless place.
Right.
Where you're supposed to be magically just okay with everything and have complete uniformity. And the whole idea of wearing, you know, white all the time wasn't really great either. There was a lady who was running these free, most older people, but I think I was one of the only young people that ever showed up. She was running this meditation session where she would have the goddess meditation, where it was supposed to be Heavenly Mother. I guess maybe God's first wife. I'm not exactly sure, but she would talk about heaven being like her vision of heaven that she would have us imagine was very different than what I was being taught in church, but I liked her version better. Her version sounded much more normal, where women sounded more empowered and you could wear whatever clothes you wanted to and have some control over your own body. So that was a nice reprieve. But it did definitely put into contrast what I wanted versus what was around me.
Did that influence your beliefs now, or what do you believe now, or what don't you believe now?
So I think I don't believe in God. I think there's no real reason why God has to exist, but I still haven't quite pulled away from learning about religion, because I just feel like there's a lot of context I didn't grow up with. Like, I know that Advent exists and that it has something to do with chocolate and prayers, And I didn't grow up knowing what Good Friday was or anything like that. And so I feel like there's some things that I should know so that when people talk about them, I have some idea of what they're talking about.
Right.
I'm also not attracted to religious ideas. I haven't been able to totally let go of everything religious, but I also keep coming back to, but this isn't real. So I'm not totally sure where I'm at yet. It's been a couple of years since I stopped going to LDS Church, and I tried going to a few other churches, and I still sometimes will listen to a UU sermon. In my hometown, I'm not living there anymore, but in my hometown there's a UU church that streams their sermons on Facebook, and so sometimes I'll listen to those.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a Community of Christ, which is like the Josephite Mormons, and they have history lectures. There's a pastor who's also a medievalist. You know, he got his degree in medieval history before he became a pastor, and he's ex-LDS, but yeah, he just gives lectures on like the medieval roots of like Christianity and a bunch of other stuff. So I also listen to those.
That's kind of cool. I mean, that's like, yeah. So it's like you can kind of appreciate the history of it while still not being totally sure about what you actually do believe. But it sounds like you're sort of on that cusp of saying that there is no God, but I mean, I get what you're saying. I mean, I think there's value in learning about, you know, the Book of Mormon, just like there's value in learning about the Bible and the Quran and things that the Buddha said, if only for the sake of being able to talk to people who believe those things, regardless of what I believe.
Right, and that's actually one of the things that led me out, was I just felt ignorant about other beliefs. Like growing up, you know, I was around this kind of weird mixture of like Mormon and evangelical fundamentalist political theology.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people would, when Obama was president, I would see Mormons and evangelicals getting together in somebody's house, trying to figure out what in the heck Obama was even talking about. Had no cultural context for what he was even saying or why, and so they were scratching their heads and going back to Cleon Skousen, who was this Mormon thinker. I don't know if you've heard of like the 5,000-year leap and things like that, but he had those kinds of books, which, by the way, when I took a couple of distance George Wythe University classes, I actually had to memorize all of the principles in the 5,000-year leap
Wow.
for my final exam. And yeah, because we had an oral final. But yeah, these people would be like, I don't know what Obama's saying, so therefore we're going to go back to our own thinkers. You know, like Skousen, who was a Mormon, but he had an unusual, very specific background, even for Mormon backgrounds, that very much influenced his theology and his political beliefs. And they were trying to use that to understand Obama. Like, Skousen says this, therefore that must be what Obama is thinking. But that doesn't really work, because Obama was coming from this, like, progressive Christian, like black progressive Christian background that had nothing to do with Southern Utah semi-polygamous white Mormonism.
Right.
And so I just felt like there were so many things in the world that I didn't understand and that I wanted to learn about.
Yeah.
And every time I would mention that I wanted to learn about other religions, most of the time the response was people being nervous, like, are you looking for a new church? Because, you know, this is the one true one. Why do you need to go learn about anyone else?
Mm-hmm.
And because I'm curious, I guess, is my answer. And so, yeah, I feel like there are interesting things. Like, for me, growing up, justice, I was always taught basically justice is when God ruins your life in order to humble you into submission. got, like, you obey or you get destroyed.
Yeah.
And I was always terrified of being, of having that threat. And I didn't always see the blessings attached. Like, if you obey this principle, you will get these blessings, but I didn't always see the blessings.
Right.
But the threat was always there, and there was always this idea of, if God isn't fulfilling that threat, we will, as a community.
Yeah.
and so, but I'm noticing as I'm starting to look at progressive Christianity, and it kind of confused me because they seem to understand justice in some other very different way that has to do with helping people, rather than saying you can choose justice or you can choose mercy, and your good leader will decide for you which one you're choosing, and you will accept that choice. They seem to think they can, like, progressive Christians seem to think that they can choose mercy and justice simultaneously. I think. I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out where they're coming from, just so that I have a basis for understanding when people are fighting on the news and sometimes they're using religious language. I want to be able to pick up on it and know where that comes from.
I don't know if this will help at all, but what it reminds me of is so I've said in some of the shows that I've released so far, but I was raised Quaker, and I learned about 5 years ago or so that solitary confinement, what we use in prisons, was created based on a Quaker principle. The principle is that, if you spend enough time alone with yourself, you will be healed to some degree, and not in like a narcissistic way, but in like a I don't know exactly how to put it. And like it was a little bit off-putting for me to learn that. And that wasn't why, I would ultimately leave Quakerism. I'd left it far before that, but I remember, when I was younger, and we would have Quaker meetings, which was, what we called church, and all that it would be was that we would sit in silence for about an hour, and then every once in a while someone would stand up and say something. But I think that maybe like that combination of both justice and mercy would be like sort of putting somebody in, for lack of a better term, like putting them in timeout, like putting them in isolation with themselves. So it's like justice is served because they're separate from society, but you're showing them mercy by not inflicting violence upon them. I don't know if that helps at all, or if that works for works for what you're talking about.
I think that probably is part of it. Yeah, I'm just trying, like, it's so weird. Like, I never knew what social justice was or anything like that, so I'm trying to figure out, where does that term even come from? Like, what is that? But yeah, that isolation thing, I think that really got picked up in Mormonism in a way that's like, that you need, like, you're basically spiritually quarantined.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of the soft / hard shunning that can happen.
Yeah, that it makes sense, but I'm sure there are other perspectives of it from that. But yeah, I mean that makes sense. And as far as social justice goes, I mean, I only really started hearing about like social justice warriors, like those types of people, for over the last like couple of years. Honestly, the types of people that are they'll like shame somebody online, for example, when they say something in one of their shows or something that they don't approve of. I don't know how much I agree with everything that they do, but I do think that there is value in letting somebody know that what they've done is hurting people, without also trying to ruin their careers at the exact same time. I mean, I think that some of that falls into free speech. And as far as religion goes, I'm not really sure. I haven't really heard it associated with religion, except for people that are offended by somebody who says something about a religion, and they sort of stand up for them.
Yeah. So that's kind of the area where I'm is I started reading this book called Religion in America since 1945. It seems like some of the roots of what we're seeing now really on both the right and the left really kind of come out of that 1940s, 1950s, and beyond. So, yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around all that, I guess, regardless of whether I don't think I could ever really commit to a religious community again.
Right.
And I don't think that like the supernatural is real. And yet I still feel like I should have some basic understanding of what kinds of denominations are out there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I get that. I mean, it's a big part of our world. You know, I've never really wanted to be one of those types of people that's like anti-religion or like, you know, or is very, like condescending towards people that hold religious beliefs. Like, you know, there are people that take it really seriously. There are people that do good for others because they believe that they should based on their religion, and there are people that fight wars based on religion. I mean, it's worth understanding without being condescending to it. So I completely get where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about religion because it is so complicated and sometimes good things happen and sometimes bad things happen. And one of my frustrations was just when religious people don't take responsibility for thinking through the consequences of their beliefs. Like if, you know, people who believe this, they tend to do things that are really extreme. Maybe we should talk about that belief not being taught or things like that. And then, you know, if they don't take that responsibility and then you point out to them, this is the possibility here that you need to look at, and then they get really mad and then they turn around and maybe hurt somebody either physically or just emotionally because they don't want to be responsible. And then they have the gall to turn around and demand respect.
Right.
And freedom and extra protections and things like that. And like, no. No, this is not how this works.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So what you just described actually reminds me of something. I was having a conversation with an ex-Muslim recently, and he brought up something that I thought was actually a really interesting way to put it. He brought up, you know, the fact that there are terrorists that believe what they're doing is right because of what they've read in the Quran, and he said that there are a lot of Muslims who would say that they're not real Muslims, you know, that the people that do that are not real Muslims because if they read the Quran, they would see that it's a book of peace. And the ex-Muslim that I spoke with, he said, I would not recommend somebody to do that because you can find things in the Quran that will justify violent behavior towards people that don't believe what you believe. You can also find in the Quran stories about reasons to help people that Muhammad wanted you to do. So it's like I think the big thing in that, the big takeaway that I had from that was like, in any holy book, you can look for something and you'll find it. You know, there in I believe it was in Exodus in the Bible. So there were lots of things that Moses talked about. They're like, I can't remember exactly how many, but there were tons of things that you can get stoned for, you know? And it's an incredible amount of things that you can get stoned for. Most of them are based around, you know, sex and infidelity and everything like that. And then you look into the New Testament and most of it is about peace and forgiveness and love. At least most of what Jesus said was. He said some violent things as well, but a lot of it was about love. So it's like, I'm conflicted as well, like about whether you know, when you're talking about like what people should be taught and what people should be paying attention to in any holy book, you know, I think it's important to have all of the information, but it's not necessarily important to take everything literally, take everything at face value, because you know if you do want to find justification for doing terrible things to people, you can find that in any holy book, just as much as you can find justifications for treating other people with dignity and respect in any holy book, depending on where you look, if you want to find them both.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of explaining it. Any holy book is not just good and it's not just evil. It is both.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And, Joseph Smith, like, would describe himself even in that way of, like, he would be known for good and evil. And I'm like, because, he was a mixture of both, although I think he was more evil than good, for sure. Yeah.
Do you have a theory? You might not have a theory, but do you have a theory about like why he would have, written the Book of Mormon? Like, do you have any? Do you think it was like for power? Do you think he just wanted to be a polygamist? Do you think that he sincerely believed it, but he was delusional, or that what? Having stepped away from it now, what do you think the reason for it existing in the first place is?
I think there's multiple possibilities. There's one guy that I heard recently that even had a theory that it might have been written more by, like, the theology might have come from Sidney Rigdon because they may have been in contact long, before it was completed, but that Joseph Smith kind of came up with the more creative aspects of the story, and that the justification for it could have been that Sidney had already made attempts to write kind of pseudo scripture and have it be accepted by his congregations and whatnot, and it hadn't been, and so he needed to have, because it was clearly written by him and not an ancient thing, and so maybe he would have wanted this guy who was already a famous treasure seer to find an ancient record, which everyone was already looking for. People had this expectation that the Native American tribes were the lost tribes of Israel, and that at some point, if you dug around enough in the mounds and other burials and whatnot, that somebody would find a record proving that. And so if you had this famous treasure digger find the record of the lost tribes of Israel, then he could fill in whatever theology he wanted, invite Joseph over and use Joseph and the book for his own purposes. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think that's an interesting idea. But yeah, I think, the guy, he did have a desire for money and power, and I think he was always kind of sexually deviant and predatory, and then eventually he tried to find a way to theologically justify that so that it would look okay to his followers,
right?
And so he could expand his network of victims. But I don't think that polygamy was a thing that he really thought of from the very outset. Yeah. But I do think that it's possible that he was abusing people for a very long time before he started this church.
How old were you when you were excommunicated?
So I wasn't actually officially excommunicated. I was kicked out of Young Women's, but then I was never really kicked out of the church officially. But my name is still on the records. And at some point, maybe I'll take it off. But yeah, I stopped going when I was 28. So.
Does your family know that you no longer identify as Mormon, that you have the religious views that you have now?
Yeah, and it's definitely a point of tension and conflict.
Do people just not talk about it when you have Thanksgiving dinner or anything like that, or is it brought up kind of passive aggressively?
There's some elements of passive aggressiveness, and I had to block my dad on Facebook because he saw me posting about Protect LDS Children, where people were telling their stories of having been asked inappropriate questions as children in bishops' interviews, and sometimes it's not even the bishop who's doing it. Sometimes it's the counselor, and sometimes it's not even in the bishop's office. It could be sometimes I was interviewed off in some classroom or even in a utility closet, the furnace room or whatever. And parents don't know where you are. And like people were talking about how dangerous that was. And Dad got super mad and wanted to basically kick me out of the family for being part of that. And at this point, I just feel like I probably shouldn't feel this way, but I don't really respect that they didn't have enough respect for themselves or me to do their due diligence to figure out whether their religion was true or good to teach people. And then they got to teach me whatever they want. They don't want to hear my opinions on anything. And they also, if they're ever told by me or by my brother or that something that they did, something that they taught us, or that they didn't protect us from in the church, like negatively impacted our lives, they don't take any responsibility for it at all. And then my dad turns around and he loves bragging about how tolerant and open-minded he is and how reasonable he is. And he isn't at all. So, yeah, well, and every time you point it out, if I point out, like, no, that's not really how it is, then I'm the bad person. And I don't trust their moral judgment. They want me to respect their beliefs, but I just don't. Mm-hmm. I don't respect their beliefs. And I'm not sure I can.
Right.
And I feel like they need to earn my respect rather than just expecting it to come automatically at this point. But they're not going to.
The way that you just described that almost sounds like there's some scandals going on with child abuse in the Jehovah's Witnesses right now, and there was one, there's one that's still ongoing with the Catholic Church. I mean, I agree. I mean, children are the ones that you should absolutely never allow anything happen to like that. And so it's like I can see how it'd be kind of hard to stand behind people who are complicit through belief in the institution that allows that to happen.
Yeah, not only that, but my dad was, he was involved in disciplinary councils where people could get excommunicated and things like that. They're called courts of love to point out how 1984 they are.
Yeah.
But my dad thinks they're wonderful things. And I know that one time he was involved in asking a kid questions because there was sexual abuse suspected and things like that. And he had no business interviewing a kid about that and deciding whether or not, he should have just called the police and had them do it.
Yeah.
Things like that. But anytime there is a choice between having his own independent thoughts or taking in anyone else's opinions or doing what's right versus doing what the church wants, anytime that there's a choice between having a good relationship with someone who's not LDS or even with someone in his family and doing what the prophet wants, he will totally choose the church every time. That is who, when it comes down to it, when the rubber meets the road, I don't feel like he really actually loves his children.
Oof.
It's the person, the thing that he loves is the church.
I can't imagine feeling that way about my dad. He and I have had our issues in the past, but I've never doubted that I was more important than his beliefs. I was very lucky in that way, especially considering how many times I've heard now that Melissa's relationship with her father is a common effect of fundamentalism. Melissa and I spoke for a few more minutes about politics, and I appreciated something that she said about how she's figuring out her stances by doing research into different topics. Many people either maintain the same political views they were raised with, or they go in the complete opposite direction when they gain control over their lives. Melissa told me that it's her desire now not to be a fundamentalist about anything. Therefore, she's taking everything piece by piece, rather than jumping from a religious cult into a political cult. The reaction to the Jussie Smollett case this week sticks out to me as one that could have benefited from Melissa's learn-as-you-go approach. First, what we thought was a hate crime led to outrage and potential political action. Then, it was revealed that Smollett orchestrated the attack, and now is being charged with a felony for falsification. It's surprising to me, both that people jumped on this situation as quickly as they did, and that people who cheered as soon as the investigation revealed it was a hoax decided to shame people who had initially expressed outrage. Neither of these groups decided to wait until the conviction, or lack thereof, to express themselves. And, just as with anything, the truth is probably going to be somewhere between just another hate crime and just another hoax. Mental health will surely be brought into play. And then people will say, poor mental health doesn't excuse potentially starting a race war or setting back years of work by people trying to expose hate crimes targeting black people or gay people. All of this is true, but are also why we have a legal system that doesn't just release people with mental health issues back into the world as though they've done nothing wrong after they've committed a crime. We could all do well to patiently learn as the truth presents itself, and to remember that there are consequences for every action, including judgment prior to having complete information. What does it say about us as a society that what separates us so deeply is whether we get prematurely excited over one thing or prematurely excited about the next thing? And then we get excited again about being allowed to lord the truth over the ones whose premature excitement ends up resembling it the least. We could alleviate all of it by denying extremism and fundamentalism and saying, I'll wait and see. The weakness and cowardice you might think you show in that moment is far less destructive to your cause than the damage you'll do to it by taking action predicated on the situation if it's shown to be inaccurately reported. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a written review and give the show 5 stars. Most importantly, share the show with someone you trust. For immediate updates and discussions, follow the show on Twitter @OutFoldPodcast. Special thanks to Melissa for approving all of this conversation being shared. Logo and artwork by my wife. Production by my wife and I. All music by me. See you in 2 weeks. This has been Out of the Fold.